Uh, Thank you very much. It's our fault because we didn't give you a title soon enough. So this is the title of our talk as it is right now. It's lovely to see some of you again. It's lovely to see all these new people. I hope the summer school is going well. Um, Robbie, Alec, and I's group has been a source of community, I think, for all three of us, and a source of excitement to share ideas. And so the way that our grant has been used has effectively been perpetuating this community between the three of us, continuing these conversations and exploring computational methods within our own projects. I'm going to discuss my own research and sort of gear it toward, I think, what will be interesting questions for this community. Then Alec is going to discuss some of the research that he's been doing. And then we're going to try to go for half an hour. That was sort of the goal. And then open it up to questions. And I think both of us will be interested in talking and responding to questions for as long as there are questions. Also, please feel free to interrupt us as we're talking. We'd like this to be as interactive as possible. Please do feel free to interrupt us with a question if you have one come up, or put one in the chat, and we'll try to address all the questions that come up in the chat as well. Okay, so jumping right into it then. So my dissertation is on the history of machine learning. I'm a historian of science and US history, historian of technology at Columbia University. I'm a PhD candidate there. I should have maybe said that at the very beginning. Telling you now you know. And particularly, my dissertation looks at the second, about 50 years from 1950 to 2000 of the development of machine learning. And part of what it discusses is how AI becomes machine learning in the 1980s. Prior to the 1980s, AI was really something very, very different than what we conceptualize as machine learning today. And in the 1980s, there's this remarkable transformation where many sub-communities within AI become something like machine learning that we understand today. My argument in the dissertation, in part, is that where machine learning comes from is actually from this separate discipline called pattern recognition that develops independently of AI from the 1950s to the 1980s. That discipline of pattern recognition is also separate from connectionism, right, which is the neural network stuff that you always hear about. But in fact, most of the sort of problem framing assumptions come from pattern recognition, I argue. And so AI in the 1980s takes pattern recognition and imports many of the problem framing strategies and techniques into AI as machine learning. Now, as I start to explore that in my dissertation, I found that in fact, there's many different notions of what machine learning is within these different communities in the 1980s. So for instance, my dissertation tracks at least 3 distinct separate definitions for what machine learning is. And so even within a single community, there was no agreed upon definition, right? But more an argument about definitions. And these definitions played a direct role in the kinds of systems they built, right? Connectionism had its own definition of machine learning that was very different from what was in AI. And pattern recognition had its own definition of machine learning that was very different from those other communities as well. And in fact, it's the pattern recognition's definition of machine learning that wins out. That I all determined using historical methods that are very familiar to a historian. But the reason we're all here today is we're very interested in how can we explore those kinds of insights that I sort of came out of my historical research. How can we do that quantitatively, right? Now, you can see there's a number of issues that come up in trying to explore this quantitatively. The most obvious is all these people are using the same term to mean something very, very different, right? And so can we track these different definitions of machine learning in these different communities using sorts of quantitative approaches, right? And so the first thing we have to handle is the simplicity of terms, right? We know for a fact, because I did the historical work, that these communities existed, right, and that they had these different definitions of machine learning. How do we track them? And so that's one problem, and I'll return to that problem here shortly. Another problem is sort of lack of representation in the data sets of articles that we have. So much of the pattern recognition research that I've been exploring and tracking from the 1950s to the 1980s hasn't been published in these very large, data sets like Web of Science, etc. And so you wouldn't know of their existence unless you did the historical work to find out that they existed, A, and then B, actually went out and found those documents in the world. If you don't do that, you just simply won't know that it exists. And so this is sort of a larger problem, right, for computational approaches, right? Trying to understand the history of science, right? How is it the case that we can necessarily recognize certain innovations, certain kinds of communities, right, that are doing new work that we care about, that's very important, but in fact doesn't exist in the data set whatsoever, right? And so that's a second problem, right? How do we incorporate the data to sort of make these sorts of explorations? So I want to just say very briefly that one way that we might want to handle or begin to address some of these problems that I just mentioned is to employ word embeddings. So Robbie, Alec, and I had this idea that each paper, and this is an idea that came out of our sort of discussions last year at the summer school, that each paper is sort of its own particular vision of the past, right? Each paper, in terms of citations that they use, is a selective vision of what was important in the past that we should pay attention to today. And so to try to explore these different communities that I just alluded to, we might, for instance, use word embeddings to see similarities across different articles and recognize communities within the similarities of the language that they use. And then once we've established those similarities or those communities through word embeddings, we might employ topic modeling on those distinct traditions that we've identified through the word embeddings. And then try to understand something about the circulation of ideas within these communities, and then how these communities interacted through the results of those sort of independent topic models. That's sort of a conceptual description. I'm not going to go into the technical details right now. And then so so that's one sort of answer to the sort of problems that I mentioned. It's important to realize that in any sort of data set, including Web of Science and other big data sets, that the creation of those data sets were not necessarily done for logical reasons, right? That there's many reasons that are not logical, that are in fact historical, why certain articles were digitized and not others. And so if we're going to use those data sets, we have to be really mindful of the historical circumstances that produced those data sets, so that we can begin to understand where the limitations of our research may exist, right? There is an impulse, I think, particularly in the science of science community, say we're talking about all of science all the time, and there's no limitations to our claims. But good scientists, of course, recognize that in fact, good science is recognizing precisely when you can't say something, when you don't have enough information to make certain kinds of claims. And so in some senses, it's an appeal to humility, right, rather than to hubris. And that how might we use our humility to do science of science better, right? How can we use our humility, in fact, to think through important questions that exist within the discipline of science of science itself? Okay, so I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to discuss more about what the specific definitions of machine learning were in the communities I looked at, if that's something that's interesting to people, or these larger questions that I discussed. I'll now hand it off to Alec, and he'll discuss some very interesting preliminary results, and he'll use graphs. So no more just talking head, now actual graphs.
Thanks. Yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to pop in. But we had an interesting rift. I would say, like methodological rift in some, I mean, just an academic discussion, but there was this side of the analyses where we take massive, like we use neural networks to create word embeddings, which are temporally cohesive, and then we track the changing meanings over time and attach them to communities of researchers using these word embeddings. That was one side, and I had sort of a reaction to that based on, well, multiple things. I mean, we have a lack of data, so we don't actually have enough data to train these models from scratch over time. We have to make a lot of assumptions in order to do that. And even that, and then we get some amalgam where we don't really know what these vectors are, how are they relating to meaning. And the data problem gets like really bad as you go further back in time. So I had a motivation to use just word counts and co-occurrence matrices of words instead of these more sophisticated approaches, because then if we can find a method which we can use on small amounts of data, then we can get a finer grained temporal resolution, and we can go all the way back. So we could use just titles of papers, for instance, and go back to 1900 and have relatively complete and clean data. So I embarked sort of parallel to what I think Aaron did most of the heavy lifting on the machine learning programming stuff. And parallel to that, I started another collaboration, which was intentionally in the same vein, which did use the simplest of methods. We tried to answer some of these questions in the simplest way. So this is economics versus sociology, just looking at the prevalence of the word in the title. So notice the benefits here. Immediately interpretable. Econ's talking about theory more often than soc. You know what it means. Okay, so that already is a solution to one of the problems. But here we can also see on the x-axis all the way from 1900 to 2025, and on the y-axis these are z-scores. So we actually have significance even in the 1900 range, where otherwise with other methods we have almost no data. How are we even going to establish that? And we haven't even begun to address Aaron's issues about like why which data is missing, but we'll leave that aside. So anyways, we can see something like sociology becoming dramatically more theoretical right around 1975, which historically makes a lot of sense as economics is sort of calcifying and becoming more of a sturdy, steady, they're not talking about theory. Let's say it that way. Experiments sort of ricocheting into the economic sphere, probably resulting, it's this, I mean, all kinds of game theory, right? Game theory experiments. So anyways, we can see dramatic changes and the shift in qualitative work. Here's some just like various topics. These are predominantly on the top, sociological topics, or were for a long time. You can see there's an interesting dynamic with migration. And on the bottom, primarily, well, there's no pattern. Okay, so anyways, these are interesting, and notice that we've predefined the communities just by what journals are they publishing in. Are they econ journals or soc journals? That's basically how we define it now. The problem becomes harder when we go to the like Aaron's use case, where there are 5 separate communities all wearing similar hats, and we can't really distinguish them except by the sort of language that they use. Okay, so another way to go, or I guess the next step in complexity, was to consider the ego net in terms of co-occurrence of a given word. So how does the concept family change over time? Instead of asking about its occurrence, just how often does it show up, we can ask about its relations to other things. What is it mentioned with? So these are really bad drawings of the ego nets of the word family in sociology and economics, and it's 2000 to 2010, right? So the methodological step then is we're going to look at differences between ego nets. So we determine a metric for this, and there's some decision to be made there, but otherwise you can just say the things that this word is mentioned with have been changing in this or that way. And we have some some, I mean, this is another logical step. So if you'll stick with me, we used sort of motivation from Granger causality. How much does the previous time in one group affect this group's current time, and vice versa? So if we compare the network of sociology 5 years ago to economics today, how does that differ from comparing sociology 5 years ago to economics today? And this is in the vein of trying to get some measure of the flow in this concept network. Is there an influence one way or the other? The answer from these plots, honestly, is we're not really sure. We'd like to be able to interpret here. So this is the term network, the egonet of network. We can see that econ, it's much higher here, indicating that there was an import. We would like to be able to interpret that there was an import of concepts from economics surrounding the word network, an import in the ways, and more so than vice versa. Okay, so this is the general gist of it. There's a lot more methodological work to be done here, and this is sort of the overall story that we were trying to tell. The person who was working with me was really hoping that there would be like periods where sociology is taking from econ, or what sociologists always say is that, you know, economists are constantly stealing from sociologists and not crediting them, something like that. But there's no difference between these two trends. So this is like the main thrust of the sort of empirics that I've been doing, and that's in line with this. I think our next step, our next step is finally to use this grant money, and we're going to meet together for a week and work together just on this project. So we're really using this as an opportunity for focus and for an event where we can aggressively collaborate for a week. So that'll happen in like a month and a half or so. And I'll leave it there. So any questions or comments or anything?
And I should maybe mention, I'm sure Alec and Robbie will feel this way as well, that if other people are working on similar questions or have similar problems, please feel free to reach out to us, directly, right? I think you can find both of us online pretty easily, all three of us online pretty easily, actually. So if you're interested in these kinds of questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, because I'm pretty sure all of us are interested in additional collaborators, and these problems are difficult ones, and they're not going to be solved by any individual, but through collective work. So we're very excited to collaborate with anyone who's interested in these sorts of questions. So please do reach out to us, and we're excited for questions.
Yeah.
Please.
So we have, thank you so much. Very exciting presentation. I love many of the points that were made, especially around data that is missing, and a topic that was popular like 15 years ago, how to track changes in concepts. I don't know if people are doing it these days with deep learning. So Han has a question. Please, Han, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Alex and Aaron. Very glad to see you both. I do have a question for Alec. So which data set do you use to do this analysis? I'm wondering, like, I didn't see that which data set you are using.
Yeah, we were using Web of Science, and we were just using all of the titles from Web of Science, from econ and sociology.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that that JSTOR might have, like, I don't know if they, like, in terms of the data, they might have a broader set of data that is not available anywhere.
Yeah,
at least
they have full text.
All text. I don't know if they have like OCR'd it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they OCR'd it before 1980, but you can do a few things. So they have a tool online that you can download up to like 25,000, like without it doing anything. And then if you want more, you just submit a researcher request, and I've gotten 1 million papers from them so far. So yeah, we do have a data set that we can use that's full text, but it's interesting. I mean, whether to use title title and abstract, title and full text. Nice thing about title is it's super clean and it's also to the point. Whereas you may be tracking all kinds of other things in the body of the text, but as Aaron likes to point out, a lot of the action happens in the body of the text, right? You would miss events that we would like to be able to detect and describe if you were just looking at what was nominally happening in the title and the abstract. So yeah, it's interesting.
So questions from these are your fellow students. So
Yeah.
from this year, please, if you have a
We
question.
really enjoyed the whole thing last year. Found it a great community building. I mean, I have 3 collaborations that came out of this, which are all productive. So it was
Great.
really good.
Great to hear. I guess I have a question for Aaron. So you're a historian and you're pointing, I think, I don't know if I'm making the right assumption, but you take like that's kind of you look at the sources, you look like it's like very opposite to what's happening with Science of Science.
Yeah, completely opposite, like almost
Yeah.
Carlo Ginzburg, almost opposite, like microhistories,
Yeah.
actually, right?
So do you have a sense of what we are missing that is like I don't know, dangerous, or like is there something that you think we should be really paying attention? And by the way, we have a presentation on I keep advertising this, but Roberta Sinatra is presenting something about biases, and it's kind of related, like we are using this data that might have biases themselves. So do you see something that is like blatantly obvious that you see with your expertise that we are missing, that we should probably capture it in some way and we should be aware of?
Yeah, well, that is a good question, and I probably won't speak to a sort of generality with like, or that I would like even, right? I think it's hard to talk about those things in really general terms. I will say sort of the obvious thing that I think probably everyone knows, which is, you know, historical data sets are created at a particular moment in time contingently, and that because they're produced at a particular moment in time for a particular set of concerns by a particular set of actors, that those data sets are going to reflect those biases. And in practice, when we've seen word embeddings used more broadly in general, right, like trained on all of Wikipedia, this is a well-known example, right? We find, lo and behold, that it induces all these sorts of gender biases, all these sorts of racial biases, right? That's well-known work, right? There's a whole community fact, right? There's a whole conference series on how these biases are built into data sets. So with regards to the sort of science community, I would say, like, I can only really speak to my particular example, but my particular example is an existence proof for a particular kind of problem that comes up all the time, right? And that problem is basically, if I were to just start with, you know, Web of Science or something, right? Or with all the articles that have been digitized already, right? What I would end up with is a very different history of AI in the 1980s, right? Because many of the most important sources for me were not digitized, right? And I only found them basically by going to the original sources, reading those sources, and then like following their citations, right? Or in some cases, even recognizing the existence of certain communities through conference proceedings that were not in fact digitized, right? And so there's a tendency, maybe I can speak a little bit more generally in this way. There's a tendency for people who want to use the history of science to do better science. And I think that the science community is interested in that. There's a tendency to sort of lean toward consensus history, I might call it. Consensus history in US history is often seen as a very bad thing. It basically assumes that the way history progresses is through agreement between groups, right? When you look at the politics of the United States, that's a very fraught way of doing history. For instance, if that is your model of history, it's very difficult to understand the civil rights in the 1960s. It just won't make sense to me because consensus history is just not the way to understand that historical set of events, right? A similar thing, some sort of criticism I think could be applied to certain kinds of histories of science, right? That sort of assume that the way science works is through consensus. But we have all these historical examples where science didn't work through consensus, right? It worked in some other ways, and not for obscure things, for the most famous things you can imagine, right? Like Maxwell's laws, right? Like the development of Maxwell's laws, like the canonical thing in physics, right? It in fact has a very complicated history that can't be described very well through sort of a consensus history approach. The tendency, if you have a large data set with a lot of articles, might be to look for patterns and consensus, right? But there's another strategy that we could use, right? Which is looking for patterns and absences, right? Now, of course, that's not a perfect strategy. It has to be supplemented with all these other kinds of things. In my case, like supplemented with historical work or sociological work, etc. Right? But like we can actually use these techniques, I would argue, in science of science, broadly speaking, to notice places that surprise us, that don't make sense, that actually contradict what we expect, rather than places, rather than looking for sort of conformity with our expectation, which is often the way that even I use it, right? Like I look at articles in the same way I might look at a thermodynamic system, right, in physics with like particles bouncing around, right? It's that kind of thinking. So what are the ways that we can maybe create sort of quantitative methods for identifying absences, right? Rather than looking at change in science as a change in conformity, right? That's sort of, okay, so I've talked probably too much. But that's sort of, in thinking about your question and how to sort of generalize that question in useful ways, that's sort of where my mind goes. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think of the Kuhn's probably, I don't know if that's something, if you're a fan of this idea of scientific revolutions, and the question is, can you even predict those? Can you even quantify? I mean, the basic, the definition is that you cannot maybe even predict these holes in our knowledge and predict these contradictions. So
it's very difficult.
Yeah, and I thought about this. I don't know if you know this. This guy, this German scientist who claimed that he invented all of the latest and greatest deep learning techniques. Yeah. I don't know what he was publishing or whether his claims are true. And there is this other Japanese scientist who invented. I think people acknowledge that now, but for a long time nobody acknowledged that he invented CNN. So, but now people are giving him credit. Anyways, very cool. So, are there any questions from the audience?
Probably.
So I have a question. Already. Yes, this is too long. And for some people, this is like in the very late. So I have a question for Alec. So I noticed that you use you kind of were very intently using interpretable ways of analyzing, like simplifying very intently. So is that something that are you looking for techniques? Do you think that is we should go back to, in a sense, to these methods of analysis that are more interpretable rather than throwing like a big neural network that will learn from Wikipedia and word to vect where you don't know what the vectors mean? You think is something that we should, do you have like some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a summary of the methodological position of my whole dissertation, but also all my projects, I just seem to end up sort of gravitating back to that because I can so quickly get to something I can actually describe and feel that I'm making progress instead of, I mean, you really don't want to be describing the features of the model, which is so hard to avoid in many cases. The other nice thing about, in this case, if you're looking at co-occurrence networks and you see a tick in change over time, in Word2Vec, you don't really have anything else you can do with that. But with the co-occurrence networks, now you can go and look at exactly how those co-occurrence networks changed over time. What concepts exactly, like what links mattered there. And you can start describing on a very granular level what's going on. And I think in describing a history, I think the specifics matter. So you end up getting, I think, something much more informative from, I mean, those are the basic motivations behind this, this technique, right? And yeah, there's a bunch of theoretical work by Cologne, I mean, he has a whole book on co-occurrence network analysis where he's mostly building up the theory of why we should care about this and relating it to actor network theory. So there's a lot of co-occurrence. I literally just mean like concepts sort of next to each other. They're just around each other. And we can make that more sophisticated, perhaps by grammatically parsing things and thinking about like, are these conjunctions or whatever, but I'm literally just thinking they're in the same title or they're in the same sentence together or the paragraph or the paper. So that's co-occurrence, answering a message in the chat. But yeah, so there's a lot of theoretical backing, I think, and a lot of like stuff that we could go back and sort of churn up. And the promise of this method for me is, yeah, to get more concretely and specifically to what's been changing and how. And it was all, I mean, really trying to address, like, we wanted to build something which could show the stuff that Aaron's finding quantitatively, but not just that, like, once you have an instrument, then you can go looking for them. So let's go look through science for all of the concept mergers where there was broad disagreement on the ways that this should be used, and then they sort of merged together. You can go and like inductively look for these in the history of science. That's a scattered answer, but yeah, I think we should start going back to that stuff. And yeah, the first paper in my dissertation is methodologically incredibly simple. It just looks for papers that are highly cited for some time, like for a decade, they're in the top 1%. And then after that, they fall dramatically. And this is exactly, I mean, he basically described the beginning of my dissertation and looking for absence and looking for unexpected things, because once a paper reaches that top 1%, it's very unlikely to fall out dramatically. It's going to have like a slow decay. It may even stay steady, but there's some that just cut off. So then asking, what about the, like, what's going on there? And it's incredibly interpretable. We say, you know, in a decade, they had 10% the average citations as the previous whole lifetime. That's a dramatic decrease. And I think it's important to get to like these really interpretable metrics, something very simple which keys in on the important point, you know.
There's like an additional thing to what Alec's saying too. I mean, I'm certain that Alec and I both agree that the reason that concepts, like the reason people start trying to look at concepts and concept formation and concept translation and deep learning and other things is probably because there's like an agreement among a lot of people that if you want to understand, you know, how words develop, you need to look at, or how ideas develop, you need to look at practices and communities and methods, right? Not words, right? Like words are a bad after image of those kinds of things. We sort of hope, like in some cases, that the words can tell us something about those practices and those communities. But we sort of all recognize that like words are really poor instruments for actually understanding practices and communities, which is, and the creation of certain ideas within those communities, right? And that's what we actually care about, right? That's what we actually want to know about. I do wish to mention really quickly to Alec's point too that you know, I think there are ways of salvaging word embeddings, but it's using them in a very different way than they're often used. So for instance, I think you can use word embeddings in a way that gives you some intuition for what they mean if you have created the corpus yourself, right? And if you can create a corpus yourself that you are confident has the information that is important to your question, then I think you can train the word embeddings on your own corpus. Like, don't use a pre-generated word embedding. That will lead you astray in all kinds of ways. Because many of the assumptions that are just taken as a given for those pre-trained word embeddings actually don't apply to your own specific project. And so I think creating your own data sets and then training your word embeddings on those data sets can make those word embeddings mean something different because you understand yourself the limitations of those embeddings, right? And you won't use them in a way that's just wildly not appropriate. But building your own data set is a mess. It's so much work. I built my own data set, right, of pattern recognition, machine learning, and AI from actual sources like, OCRing them and re-OCRing them, et cetera, et cetera. It's been years. It's literally been years. I got an NSF grant for that in 2018. I'm like just finishing up right now. So, I mean, it's like if it's important enough to do, you can do it well, but like you need to be really cognizant of how much work you may be signing up to do. But I think in those cases, if you're willing to do that work, word embeddings can be useful and even intuitive in some ways. But how rare do we get to make a data set like that and do a kind of analysis? Maybe for a PhD you can do it, but it's hard to do both.
Yeah, and with those soaring thoughts and that work of love that you're doing with your creating your data sets, and I see some comments, but I don't see any more questions. So with this, we are gonna thank both presenters again for being here today. This is very exciting. And as they said, the summer school started many collaborations, and with the hope it continues and it works the same way for many of you. So thank you again, and thank you everybody. So and I'm gonna like virtually applaud, and I will say that we're gonna leave the Zoom open. So if you want to continue interacting for your projects, but at 1 p.m. Eastern time, we'll have another 2021 presentation, the cohort from there, and I will get you the name immediately. So we have by Eunice and Alicia, it's going to be citation contract tracing, classification of retracted COVID-19 papers, and that's at 1 p.m. And with that, thank you so much again, and see you guys around. Bye. I'm gonna finish.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.